The lunchtime rush was in full swing at La Bella Vita, a cozy yet upscale restaurant nestled in the heart of the city. The air buzzed with the lively hum of conversation, the rhythmic clinking of silverware against fine china, and the occasional laughter of patrons enjoying their meals. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, casting a warm glow over the elegant decor, white tablecloths, polished wooden floors, and carefully arranged floral centerpieces. Ethan, a young and arrogant waiter, moved briskly between tables, his face set in a scowl. His mood was sour, as it often was during busy shifts, especially when dealing with customers he deemed unworthy of the establishment's sophistication. To him, appearances told the whole story, and he prided himself on identifying those who, in his opinion, didn't belong. The bell above the restaurant's entrance chimed softly, drawing a few glances. An elderly man stepped inside, pausing just beyond the door. He was dressed in worn-out clothes, an old faded jacket and scuffed shoes. His posture was slightly stooped, and he leaned on a weathered wooden cane as he looked around, his gaze calm and observant. His steps were slow and deliberate, his hands faintly trembling as he steadied himself. Ethan noticed him immediately, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. With a sigh, he muttered under his breath and reluctantly approached the man, bracing himself for what he assumed would be another table he wouldn't enjoy serving. The elderly man slowly made his way to a table by the window, settling into the seat with a quiet sigh. Ethan rolled his eyes, barely hiding his annoyance. Of course, the old man had chosen one of the best spots in the restaurant, prime seating usually reserved for high-paying customers. Without a word, Ethan grabbed a menu from the counter and strode over, slamming it down on the table. The plates on the table rattled slightly from the impact. The old man looked up, his expression gentle, unfazed by the rude gesture. "Thank you, young man," he said with a warm smile. Ethan didn't bother responding. Instead, he crossed his arms and tapped his foot impatiently as the old man slowly opened the menu. After a moment of scanning, the elderly man glanced up. "Do you have any recommendations?" he asked kindly. Ethan let out an exaggerated sigh. "Depends. How much are you willing to spend?" His voice dripped with sarcasm, and a few nearby customers turned their heads, their expressions shifting. The old man chuckled softly. "I was just wondering what you'd suggest." Ethan gave a half-hearted shrug. "If you're looking for something cheap, we have a soup of the day. It's nothing special, but it'll fill you up." The old man nodded, completely unbothered by the dismissive tone. "That sounds perfect. I'll have that, please." Ethan barely contained his irritation. Of course, the old man had ordered the cheapest thing on the menu. He'd probably take forever to eat and leave a tiny tip if he left anything at all. "Fine," Ethan muttered, snatching the menu off the table without another word. As he walked away, a few customers exchanged glances. Some whispered to each other, clearly unsettled by his attitude, but no one said anything. The old man, however, simply sat there, looking out the window with the same serene expression, as if nothing had happened at all. As the elderly man sat patiently by the window, Ethan continued to ignore him. The old man had politely asked for a glass of water and a napkin, but Ethan acted as if he hadn't heard a thing. Instead, he busied himself with other tables, smiling and chatting with customers he deemed worthy of good service. Minutes passed and the old man remained silent, his hands folded neatly on the table. He didn't complain or wave Ethan down. He simply waited. When Ethan finally passed by again, the man gently asked, "Would it be possible to get a glass of water, please?" Ethan exhaled sharply, shaking his head as he turned away. Under his breath, he muttered, "People shouldn't eat where they can't afford." Though his words were meant to be quiet, a nearby couple overheard and frowned. One of them nudged their partner, whispering something, but still no one spoke up. A few minutes later, Ethan emerged from the kitchen with the old man's soup. Instead of setting it down carefully, he all but tossed the plate onto the table. The bowl wobbled, and a bit of soup sloshed over the side, staining the crisp white tablecloth. The old man looked down at the mess, then back up at Ethan, but instead of frustration or anger, there was only warmth in his expression. "Thank you, young man," he said softly, reaching for his spoon. Ethan's jaw clenched. He had expected irritation, maybe even a complaint. But this unwavering kindness, this calm patience, somehow frustrated him more. Across the room, the whispers grew louder. More customers had noticed Ethan's behavior, and their disapproving glances became harder to ignore. But the elderly man remained undisturbed, stirring his soup with steady hands, as if nothing in the world could shake his peace. As the elderly man ate his soup in slow, measured spoonfuls, Ethan leaned against the counter, rubbing his temples. He had no patience for difficult customers, especially ones who wasted his time with tiny orders and no tips. He had done his job, hadn't he? It wasn't his fault. The old man didn't belong in a place like this. Just then, a sharp gasp broke through the steady hum of restaurant chatter. "Oh my God," a woman at a nearby table whispered, her voice filled with astonishment. Ethan glanced over, mildly curious. The woman and her companion were staring at a glossy magazine, spread open on the table. Their eyes flicked between the pages and something or someone across the room. "That's him," the woman hissed, barely able to contain her excitement. "He owns half the city," her companion murmured in disbelief. "Why would he be here dressed like that?" Ethan frowned, their words tugging at his curiosity. He edged closer, trying to catch a glimpse of the magazine. At first he could only make out bold black letters sprawled across the top of the page, but when he finally saw the accompanying image, his stomach dropped. There, staring back at him from the magazine, was a picture of the old man. The same frail hands that now held a soup spoon had once been captured shaking hands with CEOs. The same tired eyes had once been photographed surveying towering skyscrapers. Ethan's breath hitched. His eyes darted to the headline, "Richard Hayes, the billionaire who disguises himself to test businesses." A wave of cold panic washed over him. His mind raced, replaying every single interaction he'd had with the old man, the dismissive tone, the sarcastic responses, the spilled soup. The poor old man he had just insulted was none other than Richard Hayes, one of the most powerful business moguls in the country, the owner of countless luxury establishments, and worst of all, the owner of La Bella Vita. Ethan's throat went dry. His legs felt like lundi. Richard Hayes wasn't just another customer, he was his boss, and he had seen everything. Ethan's hands felt clammy as he gripped the edge of the counter. His heart pounded so loudly that he barely registered the sounds of the restaurant around him. He slowly turned his head toward the old man, no Richard Hayes, who was now calmly wiping his mouth with a napkin. There was no sign of anger on his face, no outburst, no dramatic reaction. He simply folded the napkin neatly and placed it beside his empty bowl. Ethan swallowed hard. Maybe, just maybe, Richard hadn't noticed his behavior. Maybe he would just finish his meal and leave. But then the restaurant manager appeared, a man in his 50s, always professional, always polished. The manager approached Richard with a nervous smile. His posture was stiff, his hands slightly trembling as he clasped them together. The weight of the situation was sinking in. "Mr. Hayes," the manager greeted him, his voice laced with apprehension. "It's an honor to have you here." "If I had known," Richard raised a hand, silencing him with a gentle but firm gesture. Then, to Ethan's horror, Richard turned his gaze toward him and gave a slight nod. The manager followed his gaze, his face draining of color as he realized what had happened. His eyes darted back and forth between Ethan and Richard, and a sickening understanding dawned upon him. The restaurant fell into an eerie silence. Richard finally spoke, his voice steady, authoritative, but not unkind. "I came here today expecting nothing but a meal," he began, his eyes fixed on Ethan. "I did not expect to be treated as anything more than a regular customer, but what I did expect was basic decency." Ethan's stomach twisted into knots. He felt every pair of eyes in the restaurant locked onto him, judging, waiting for what would come next. Richard continued, "Hospitality is not about serving the wealthy. It is not about offering respect only to those who look important." His voice carried through the room, sharp but calm. "True service, true kindness, is shown to everyone, regardless of how they appear." A few whispers passed through the crowd, but no one dared to interrupt. Ethan's mouth went dry. He wanted to speak, to apologize, to explain, but no words came out. He was frozen, trapped in the reality of his own actions, and he had no idea what was going to happen next. Ethan's throat was dry, his pulse pounding in his ears. His mouth opened, but the words wouldn't come out. Finally, he managed to stammer, "Sir, I didn't mean." Richard Hayes simply shook his head, a quiet disappointment in his eyes. He didn't need to say anything else. The weight of Ethan's actions had already settled heavily on his shoulders. Without another word, Richard reached into his pocket, pulled out a few crisp bills, and placed them neatly on the table. It was more than enough to cover his small meal, far more than what was necessary. A generous tip, despite the mistreatment he had endured. Ethan swallowed hard. Richard turned back to him, his voice steady but firm. "Money doesn't determine a person's worth," he said. "Kindness and respect do. You never know who you're serving, or what they might be going through, but you should treat everyone with dignity, no matter what." Ethan dropped his gaze, shame washing over him like a wave. Richard straightened his jacket and turned toward the manager. The tension in the room was suffocating as every single person, customers, staff, even other waiters, waited for what he would say next. "Make sure he learns this lesson well," Richard said calmly. The manager nodded quickly, understanding the weight of the words. Ethan stood frozen, his heart racing. Would he be fired, reprimanded? He had no idea what was coming, but he knew one thing for certain: his arrogance had finally caught up with him. As Richard walked toward the exit, the restaurant remained eerily silent. The moment the door closed behind him, the hushed murmurs returned. Some customers glanced at Ethan with disapproval, while others simply sat in thought, absorbing what had just happened. Ethan stood motionless, his stomach churning. He had learned his lesson, but whether it was too late to fix his mistakes, he wasn't sure. News of the incident spread quickly through the restaurant, and soon enough, the entire staff was whispering about Ethan's confrontation with Richard Hayes. Word traveled beyond the walls of La Bella Vita, from customers who had witnessed the scene to others who had heard the tale secondhand. Ethan's face burned with humiliation every time someone glanced his way. Whether he would lose his job or not was uncertain, but the sting of shame had already settled deep inside him. What became clear, however, was that the restaurant staff had changed. They treated every customer, rich or poor, with renewed respect, as if seeing through the surface and recognizing the inherent value of every individual. The lesson that kindness mattered more than appearances wasn't just learned by Ethan, it was absorbed by everyone who worked there. As for Ethan, the weight of Richard's words stayed with him long after the day ended. He realized that kindness cost nothing, but it had the power to change everything, both in how we see others and in how we see ourselves. From that day on, Ethan worked harder, not just to improve his service, but to be a better person, and in his heart, he carried the quiet but profound truth that respect and humility can go much further than wealth or status ever will. Thank you for watching this story. It's a powerful reminder that kindness and respect matter more than appearances or status, and how sometimes we don't realize the value of the people around us until it's too late. We hope this story resonated with you and left you thinking about how we treat others in our daily lives. If you enjoyed this story, please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more inspiring and emotional tales. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Did the story remind you of any personal experiences? Share it with your friends and family to spread the message of kindness. Your support helps us bring more meaningful stories to life, so don't forget to share and keep spreading positivity. Thanks again for being part of our journey.